In today's video, we'll examine 5 deadly encounters between snake enthusiasts and their serpentine predators. From a teenage collector's fatal anaconda encounter in Florida to an exotic breeder's king cobra bite in Jakarta. But first, we start with the story of the last minutes of a snake-obsessed woman. It was July 14th, 2016 in Dayton, Ohio. The summer heat lingered into the evening, pressing against the quiet neighborhood as porch lights flickered on. In one of the modest 2-story homes, the basement had been converted into a reptile room. That night, what was supposed to be routine maintenance of an enclosure ended in violence that could not be undone. Kelly Hammond was 38, a retail worker who had developed a reputation in her community for her fascination with snakes. Friends described her as steady and methodical, someone who spent most of her spare time caring for her collection. Over the years, she had accumulated more than a dozen pythons, Burmese and reticulated among them. It wasn't a casual hobby. Her basement contained heating systems, stacked glass enclosures, and feeding logs written in careful handwriting. Though she lacked formal training, she had immersed herself in books, online forums, and reptile shows. Neighbors sometimes saw her outside, a massive snake draped around her shoulders while she adjusted it with practiced movements. To her, the animals were not dangerous pets, but a challenge to manage responsibly. That night, her goal was simple: clean the enclosure of her largest reticulated python, a 16-foot specimen weighing over 120 pounds. She had handled it dozens of times before, confident that her familiarity and grip were enough. She invited a close friend to assist, partly to capture the routine on camera for her collection. It was a decision made casually, one that felt safe because it had always gone without incident. Reticulated pythons are the longest snakes in the world, with adults often exceeding 15 feet in captivity. Though non-venomous, they kill by constriction, tightening each coil every time their prey exhales. Their bodies are pure muscle, able to exert crushing pressure strong enough to crack ribs or stop circulation within minutes. Captive specimens retain the same hunting instincts as their wild counterparts, responding quickly to movement and body heat. Warnings existed. Local animal control had reminded reptile owners of the risks after prior incidents in Ohio, including fatal constrictions in private homes. Herpetologists caution against handling large pythons alone or without proper safety tools like hooks or barriers. Hammond had read these advisories but often felt they overstated the danger. She trusted her experience, having draped the snake around her shoulders countless times. That evening, her friend asked if it was safe to stand close with the camera. Hammond reassured her, saying the animal was used to handling. At first, the snake slid from her arms with slow, heavy movements. Hammond shifted its bolt carefully, trying to guide it into a temporary container while she cleaned. Then, in a sudden shift, the animal coiled upward, looping around Hammond's torso. Her arms were pinned against her sides, her balance tipping backward. At first, her friend thought it was part of the demonstration. Hammond had often shown how strong the python was, letting it cling to her before gently unwinding it. But this time, the coils tightened sharply, each contraction pushing deeper into her chest. She managed to say she couldn't breathe, her voice broken and strained. The python's head angled upward, pressing against her neck. Hammond staggered and fell hard onto the floor, the weight of the snake driving into her ribs. Her friend dropped the camera and tried to pry at the coils, but they didn't move. The snake's body tightened rhythmically, each exhale met with a squeeze. The sound of ribs cracking broke through the struggle, described later as a sharp snap like dry wood splitting. Hammond screamed once, then the air left her body in a shudder. Her face flushed red, then purple, as the python's body worked higher, circling her shoulders and jaw. The bulk of the animal covered her chest and head, muffling any further sound. Her friend pulled and shouted for help, but the weight and strength of the snake were impossible to overcome. A neighbor who heard the cries went in and saw the situation. He immediately called animal control. Minutes stretched as she went still, her body pinned under the shifting coils. By the time animal control arrived, Hammond was unresponsive. The python had loosened slightly, its body resting heavy across her torso. Removing it required multiple officers, each pulling to unwind the coils one by one. And by the time she was free, she was pronounced dead at the scene. Her body showed deep bruises along the chest and back, broken ribs, and severe compression injuries. Her funeral in Dayton was small, attended by family and a handful of fellow reptile enthusiasts. The service was quiet, reflecting her life more than her death. Local authorities seized her remaining snakes, relocating them to licensed facilities under tighter supervision. Ohio's Department of Agriculture reviewed private ownership laws for large constrictors, citing the case as evidence that stricter enforcement was necessary. Yet, even as Kelly Hammond's ribs cracked audibly under the crushing coils, just a year earlier in Florida, a teenager would wrap a massive anaconda around his shoulders to impress his classmates, never realizing that it was his final pose. It was March 19, 2015 in Tampa, Florida. The air was heavy with humidity, the kind that clung to garages and dim backyards as dusk set in. Inside one suburban home, the sounds of teenagers talking and laughing filled the cluttered space. A reptile cage dominated one corner, and what began as a show of confidence would end in silence that no one present could forget. Marcus Rivera was 17, a high school junior with a restless energy and a fascination with reptiles. Known among friends for showing off unusual pets, he had gradually collected lizards, pythons, and finally a green anaconda he had purchased from a private breeder despite local restrictions. He nurtured a reputation as the one willing to handle what others would not, priding himself on strength and control. His parents had warned him repeatedly, but he brushed it off, convinced he had the knowledge to manage the animals. For Marcus, the anaconda was not just a pet, but proof of his daring. He wasn't careless, he fed and cleaned its enclosure regularly, but he also enjoyed the thrill of draping the heavy body over his shoulders, posing for photos and videos. That evening, he invited 3 classmates over, promising to show them how he could handle the 12-foot snake. They came expecting a spectacle. His decision to stage the display in the garage, away from parental oversight, was typical of the way he balanced discipline with recklessness. The garage was dim, a single overhead bulb casting shadows across boxes and tools. A faint, musky odor came from the enclosure where the snake shifted restlessly. The humid Florida air pressed into the closed space, making every movement feel heavier. The teenagers gathered close, their attention fixed on Marcus as he prepared. Green anacondas are the heaviest snakes in the world, reaching lengths over 20 feet in the wild. Though smaller in captivity, even a 12-foot individual is a muscular predator capable of exerting immense pressure. Their instinct is not aggression but constriction, responding quickly to movement and heat, tightening coils each time their prey exhales. Unlike pythons, anacondas rely on sheer mass, wrapping and holding until circulation and breathing cease. In confined spaces, the risk increases as there is no distance for a handler to maneuver. Previously, Marcus's parents had told him repeatedly to leave the snake in its enclosure when friends visited. Even online forums he frequented were filled with cautionary stories of constrictors turning deadly. Even his classmates hesitated, one asking quietly if it was safe. Marcus dismissed the concerns, pointing out that he had handled the snake many times before. For him, the demonstration was routine, a another opportunity to show his control. He opened the enclosure and drew the snake out slowly, its patterned body sliding across the floor with a weight that took effort to manage. At first, the movement was playful. Marcus smiled as he hefted the bulk over his shoulders, the snake draping around his neck and chest. The others filmed from close range, capturing his steady stance and the snake's slow, deliberate movements. Then the animal shifted, coiling tighter across his torso. At first, he laughed, adjusting his grip as though it were part of the show. But the coils kept sliding upward, circling his chest and throat. His expression changed, laughter giving way to a sharp intake of breath. His arms couldn't find leverage. He staggered backward, knees buckling under the weight. The muffled thud of his fall against the garage floor echoed as his friends shouted in confusion. He gasped, clawing at the muscular body pressed against his throat. Each exhale was met with another tightening. His face turned red, then darkened as the pressure built. The others tried to intervene, pulling at the coils, but the snake's body was immovable, its strength far beyond theirs. The sounds in the garage became a mix of his choking gasps and their frantic yelling. One friend pulled the pocket knife from his jeans and began jabbing at the snake's thick body, leaving only shadow cuts that oozed but did not deter it. Instead of loosening, the snake shifted again, circling tighter, driving its bulk across Marcus's ribs. One of his friends dialed 911. A loud crack rang out, the sound of bone giving way under pressure. His body convulsed briefly, heels scraping against the concrete before the motion slowed. The friends screamed his name, pulling, cutting, and shouting, but the snake did not release. By the time paramedics arrived, Marcus was motionless, his skin marked with deep bruises and abrasions where scales had torn into flesh. It took multiple responders to force the coils apart, prying and unwinding inch by inch until his body was freed. The snake lay subdued, and Marcus showed no pulse. Florida authorities seized the anaconda and emphasized the ongoing difficulties in enforcing exotic pet regulations. Local media reported briefly, focusing on the dangers of large constrictors in private homes, but coverage faded quickly. The funeral took place within the week, drawing classmates, teachers, and extended family. School counselors offered sessions for those who had witnessed the event, recognizing the trauma it left behind. While Marcus Rivera's body convulsed under the anaconda's crushing embrace, just 2 years later in Yorkshire, an experienced snakekeeper would lift his protective visor to wipe away sweat, giving a lightning-fast cobra the split second it needed to deliver its lethal bite. It was October 6, 2017 in rural Yorkshire, England. The air was damp and cool, mist drifting over quiet fields as evening settled in. In one outbuilding at the edge of a modest property, fluorescent light flickered across glass tanks and metal racks. What had begun as a routine cleaning task would soon turn into a fatal encounter. Alan Brooke was 44 years old, a part-time zoo volunteer and longtime reptile enthusiast. By profession, he worked irregular jobs in construction, but his reputation among reptile keepers was built on his private collection of snakes. He had started with pythons in his 20s, gradually shifting toward venomous species as his confidence grew. Friends in reptile circles regarded him as disciplined, though not without a degree of pride in handling animals others avoided. His property housed several cobras, vipers, and rattlesnakes in carefully secured enclosures. For Brooke, the animals represented both fascination and mastery. He'd read extensively about their behavior, practiced with handling tools, and visited other collections to compare methods. His habits were meticulous: gloves, hooks, tongs, and a visor when working directly with the snakes. Yet familiarity had dulled his sense of risk. He invited fellow hobbyists over to observe, often to demonstrate technique. That Friday evening, he had asked a friend to watch as he cleaned the enclosure of a monocled cobra, an adult specimen nearly 5 feet long. The plan was simple: remove the animal temporarily, clean the tank, and return it. The monocled cobra is native to South and Southeast Asia. Recognizable by the circular marking on the back of its hood, it can reach lengths of 7 feet. Its venom is primarily neurotoxic, disrupting nerve signals and leading to paralysis. Symptoms can appear rapidly: drooping eyelids, slurred speech, difficulty breathing. Without specific antivenom, death may occur within hours, sometimes minutes depending on the dose. The species is considered unpredictable, prone to sudden defensive strikes if threatened or startled. Before the incident, warnings have been given many times. Colleagues at the zoo where Brooke volunteered had cautioned him against maintaining such species at home. Licensing rules were strict, requiring secure housing and protocols, but enforcement was light. His wife had asked him repeatedly to keep his collection smaller, pointing to the risks of a bite when no hospital nearby stocked the necessary antivenom. Even his visiting friend reminded them as they prepared that evening to keep the visor secured and never break concentration. Brooke acknowledged the risks, but believed his tools and experience were enough. He slid open the enclosure carefully, guiding the cobra out with a hook. The animal lifted its hood slightly, tongue flicking, but allowed itself to be placed into a holding tub. Brooke began cleaning, scraping away waste and replacing substrate while speaking casually about technique. Sweat gathered on his forehead under the visor. At one point he paused, raising the visor briefly to wipe his face with the back of his hand. His friend noted the lapse but said nothing, expecting the visor to drop back down. The strike was sudden. As Brooke leaned close to adjust the water dish, the cobra reared, head flattening into a hood, and struck forward. Its fangs punctured his left cheek just below the eye. He recoiled instantly, knocking the hook against the glass, and staggered back, clutching his face. Thin trails of blood mixed with saliva dripped onto the floor. His friend froze, then shouted for him to sit down. Within minutes, the symptoms began. Brooke's eyelids drooped, and his speech slurred as he tried to reassure himself aloud. His breathing grew shallow, each attempt more labored than the last. He dropped the visor and gloves, collapsing onto a chair as his muscles weakened. His friend dialed emergency services, his voice panicked, reporting the bite and naming the species. Operators instructed him to keep Brooke still and apply pressure immobilization, but there was little he could do. Brooke's hands trembled violently before his muscles began twitching, stiffening in uneven spasms as paralysis spread. By the time paramedics arrived, his skin was pale and clammy, his eyes unfocused. They began CPR after he lost consciousness, but no facility nearby carried the precise antivenom required for monocled cobra envenomation. He was rushed toward the nearest hospital, an oxygen mask pressed over his face, but the paralysis spread, shutting down his ability to breathe independently. Despite all measures, he was pronounced dead less than 2 hours after the bite. The aftermath was quiet. His body was released to his family within days. At his funeral, a small group gathered: relatives, a few colleagues from the zoo, and reptile enthusiasts who had known him through forums and meetings. Local authorities reviewed his permits and seized the venomous animals from the property. In Yorkshire, officials tightened monitoring of exotic animal licensing, though no new laws were passed. However, even as Alan Brooke staggered with cobra venom dripping from his cheek, 4 years earlier in Texas, a retiree would discover that 20 years of raising his prized Burmese python meant nothing when 20 feet of crushing muscle was unleashed upon his aging body. It was May 24th, 2013, outside San Antonio, Texas. The spring evening was still and heavy with heat, the kind that lingered after the sun had dropped. In a weathered shed at the back of a rural property, a retired man struggled with an animal he had raised for years. The situation would escalate slowly, then violently, until it left him lifeless on the ground. Harold Duncan was 61 years old, a retired machinist who had spent much of his later life in seclusion. Widowed and with few close friends, he poured his energy into an unusual pursuit: keeping large snakes. He had built a series of makeshift enclosures in his shed, reinforced with plywood, wire, and chains. Neighbors knew him only in passing, remarking on the occasional smell of rodents or the faint hiss that carried on quiet nights. Among reptile enthusiasts, he was less known, but those who had visited described him as dedicated, methodical, and proud of his collection. The centerpiece of his animals was a Burmese python he had acquired as a juvenile nearly 2 decades earlier. By 2013, the snake measured over 20 feet and weighed more than 200 pounds. Duncan often boasted privately to relatives that the python was calm and accustomed to his presence. Burmese pythons are among the largest snakes in the world, capable of growing over 20 feet and exerting immense constriction pressure. Their bodies are built for ambush predation, wrapping prey and tightening with every exhalation until circulation and breathing cease. Though not venomous, their power alone makes them capable of killing a human in minutes. In captivity, they may appear tame, but their instincts remain unchanged. Even long-term owners face sudden shifts in behavior, especially during feeding or when the animal feels confined. He rarely asked for help handling it, insisting he could manage the animal on his own. His habits were consistent: feeding frozen rabbits, cleaning the enclosure monthly, and repairing the aging structure when needed. That spring, one of the cage latches had broken. Rather than leave the snake contained and call for assistance, Duncan decided to move it himself to another holding area. Relatives had urged Duncan not to handle the python alone, pointing out his age and declining strength. Local authorities, responding to previous calls about the snakes, had noted the inadequate housing but stopped short of seizing the animal. A neighbor recalled hearing odd thuds and muffled calls from the shed earlier that evening, but assumed it was routine. But when Duncan's niece stopped by to drop off groceries and found the shed door ajar, she discovered him inside, already entangled. The python had coiled around Duncan's lower body, pinning his legs together with bands of muscle. His face was dark red, his breath shallow and broken. He could only force out a few gasps before falling silent. Each attempt to push the animal away only caused it to cinch tighter. The shed echoed with the scrape of wood as Duncan stumbled back against the wall, dragging the massive reptile with him. The coils rose higher, locking around his abdomen and chest. He dropped to the floor under the weight, his arms pinned awkwardly against his side. His niece later told deputies she heard a faint groan and then nothing more as his chest compressed. The sound of ribs giving way was faint but distinct. She screamed for help, running to the road to flag passing drivers. The python shifted again, wrapping around his neck and head, leaving only muffled grunts beneath its tightening grip. Duncan's movement slowed, his body jerking weakly as his airway collapsed. When deputies and animal control arrived minutes later, the scene was grim. The snake held Duncan flat against the floor, its coil spread across his torso and face, eyes fixed forward. The officers attempted to pry it off, but the pressure was immovable. Finally, one officer raised a shotgun and fired into the snake's body. The coil slackened gradually, the massive animal thrashing weakly before falling still. Duncan lay beneath it, unresponsive. His chest collapsed inward from the crushing force. Paramedics confirm he had suffered massive internal injuries and cardiac arrest, declaring him dead at the scene. In the days that followed, the property was cleared of the remaining snakes, most smaller but still exotic. Authorities cited the unsafe enclosures and lack of proper permits, though no charges were filed posthumously. His funeral was modest, attended by a handful of relatives and 2 former co-workers. There were no eulogies beyond a brief statement from a cousin about his quiet life. Among neighbors, the reaction was muted, with a few expressing relief that the snakes were gone. Harold Duncan's desperate gasps echoed through his Texas shed, while 5 years later in Jakarta, a breeder would lift a king cobra with his bare hands to impress potential buyers, dismissing the ancient predator's lightning-fast strike. It was December 1st, 2018 in Jakarta, Indonesia. The day had ended hot and thick with humidity, and inside a small residential neighborhood, a narrow house doubled as a reptile workshop. Within its concrete walls, glass tanks lined the room, their contents restless in the warm air. Among them was a snake unlike the others, larger, faster, and far more dangerous. By nightfall, its keeper would be dead. Rizky Hartono was 32 years old, known in Jakarta's small reptile trade circles as a determined breeder with a steady supply of both native and exotic species. He sold pythons, vipers, and other snakes to local collectors, making side income that supplemented his modest day job as a delivery driver. He had gained a reputation for being bold with his animals, often handling them bare-handed to prove he could. To his buyers, this gave him authority. To his family, it was reckless. Still, for Hartono, the snakes were his passion, and he believed they could bring him enough recognition to expand into a larger business. The centerpiece of his collection was a massive king cobra, nearly 12 feet long, purchased through informal channels. He saw it as proof he could handle the most respected and feared species in Southeast Asia. To him, demonstrating control of such a snake was both a selling point and a test of skill. The cobra lived in a reinforced glass enclosure in the corner of his breeding room. The king cobra, the longest venomous snake in the world, can reach over 18 feet in length and deliver enough neurotoxic venom in a single bite to kill an elephant. Its strike is sudden and precise, capable of hitting vital areas even when handled by experts. Unlike many snakes, cobras can deliver multiple strikes in rapid succession, and their venom attacks the nervous system, causing paralysis and respiratory failure. Handling one without protective gear is a direct confrontation with a lethal predator. The house stood in a dense neighborhood, concrete alleys crowded with parked scooters, laundry lines strung between windows, and the smell of cooking oil heavy in the air. Inside Hartono's reptile room, the overhead bulb cast sharp shadows against the tanks, highlighting the dull scales of coiled snakes. When 2 customers arrived that evening, Hartono saw an opportunity to make an impression, deciding to bring the animal out directly rather than relying on hooks or tongs. His motivation was not carelessness but conviction that showing confidence with the cobra would close the sale. However, warnings had surrounded Hartono for years. Other breeders had told him not to free-handle venomous snakes. His own uncle had cautioned him that anti-venom was not always available in local clinics. That evening, one of the customers hesitated as Hartono unlatched the cobra's tank, suggesting they observe from behind the glass. Hartono brushed it off, insisting he had experience. His choice was less about arrogance than about trust in a routine that had not yet failed him. He slid open the glass and reached inside, gripping the thick body just behind the head. At first, the cobra stiffened, its hood flaring, tongue flicking rapidly as it read the air. Hartono raised it chest high, turning toward the two men to demonstrate the size and control. For a moment, it appeared manageable. Then, the cobra coiled abruptly in his hands, twisting with startling speed. Before Hartono could adjust, it struck his forearm, once, then again, sinking its fangs deep. Witnesses later described him freezing, his eyes wide as if trying to process the suddenness of the bite. His grip slackened, and he set the snake back into its enclosure, locking it with trembling fingers. He tried to dismiss the incident, insisting it wasn't serious. But within 10 minutes, his condition began to change. First dizziness and nausea, then vomiting into a bucket by the wall. His skin grew pale as he staggered, clutching the bitten arm. As the next 20 minutes passed, neurotoxic symptoms advanced. His speech slurred, his eyelids drooped, and his jaw muscles weakened. He dropped heavily to the floor. The customers, panicked, tried to support him, one rushing outside to hail a motorcycle taxi. They carried him into the street, his legs dragging, his eyes half-lidded as his breath turned shallow and irregular. By the time they reached a nearby clinic, his pulse was erratic, his body seizing as the neurotoxin advanced. The staff could do little. They had no cobra anti-venom in stock. An ambulance was called to transfer him to a larger hospital across the city. During the ride, his breathing ceased, his chest heaving once before going still. Paramedics performed compressions, but by the time they arrived at the hospital, his heart had already stopped. Efforts to restart it failed. Back at the house, police sealed off the reptile room, photographing the enclosure and securing the live cobra for transfer to a government facility. The customers provided statements, explaining how quickly the strike had unfolded. Hartono's phone, left on the table, still displayed the open gallery where he had shown them pictures of previous sales just minutes before the attack. His funeral, held 2 days later, was modest. Family members, shaken but subdued, stood alongside a handful of reptile enthusiasts who had known him casually. Indonesian authorities released a statement afterward, reminding the public that handling venomous snakes without protective tools is illegal, and that private ownership of species like king cobras poses risks beyond the individual. No charges were filed against the family, and the story ran only in local outlets. Thanks for watching. If these stories of overconfidence turned fatal entertained you, click here for more.